Video recordings of this podcast can be found on raisingequity.org and Raising Equity on YouTube.
Hey folks, I'm Dr. Kira Banks and welcome to Raising Equity. In today's Diversity Download, I want to share a little tidbit about the tension between internal and external DEI work. I was talking to a client and they were asking me, where should we start? We had been doing some internal work to build our ability to have difficult dialogues, courageous conversations, and that sort of kind of belonging, inclusive dialogue work. But now we have a group of folks who are really energized about doing the work in a public-facing way. What do we need to be doing in terms of policy, advocacy? What are we doing with our external partners in the community? So they were basically asking me, what's your vote? So I think it's really important to remember that it's a both and approach rather than either or. Both external facing and internal facing work are important. I do think it's worth considering though, are you prepared to do the external work that you want to do, right? So what I've seen is organizations get really excited because in a way, it's more visible to do the external work. Not only do people see it within the organization, but folks in the community are seeing your partnerships, your collaborations. Maybe it's a long time coming sort of, external work. And that's great. But if you're doing that work and don't have the internal capacity to hold it, what can happen is that as people start to interact with the organization, kind of pull behind the curtain, they see, oh, wait a minute. What they're saying externally doesn't match what's happening internally. And it can start to feel kind of disingenuous, like, oh, wait, maybe we don't trust that they're really doing this external work for the right reasons. Maybe they're just doing it to look good. Or perhaps we shouldn't trust how they're moving in community because if this is happening internally, will it happen to us eventually, right? So it can breed distrust if you don't have your internal house in order a bit. So I'm not saying wait till everything's perfect because we're not going to be ruled by perfectionism. It doesn't have to be a sequential, first internal, then external, but it can be a both and. So you do want to make sure that you have given some really good attention to what's happening internally. What do you have in place to support folks around things like everyday microaggressions and to be able to have those sorts of courageous conversations? What do you have in place in terms of transparency? Thinking about equity in terms of pay and people being promoted and people having access and opportunity to be able to develop and grow in the organization. What are your retention numbers in terms of folks from underrepresented groups that have been historically overlooked by your organization? You want to be able to answer those questions and have done some work internally or have some plan of action so that when you go to move externally, you can honestly say we're engaged in this work, not just to look good, not just to make symbolic statements or grand gestures, but because we're also doing it internally. The other thing I'll say is I've seen organizations that focus externally, and because they haven't done what they need to internally, what happens is people leave the organization. They're like, wait a minute. I don't trust that we are the ones to do this work because we haven't done what's right by our employees or by folks who are inside the organization. And so sometimes you can lose really good talent by jumping the gun to do external work in a way that might make people distrust and not believe that you're in it for the right reasons. So while I do think it's a both and, this tension between internal and external work is in some ways false because they're both necessary. I do think there's a way in which that internal work should happen so that folks can internally and externally can trust the work you're doing. As you're thinking about this as both and work, really map out what's happening internally and externally so that you can know what's happening kind of concurrently, right? I've seen some organizations fall into the trap of feeling like, well, if we're doing the external work, we don't have to do internal work. Like that's too much. There's too many initiatives and efforts going on, but they're very distinct work. So know that they actually support each other. If you have to choose one or the other, like I said, I would say choose to make sure you shore up what's happening internally, but you really can and should think about them as separate tracks of work so that it doesn't have to be a competition. You don't have to have team external or team internal, right? They really can feed and support each other. So I encourage you, if you're an organization that's mapping out this work and thinking kind of like short, mid, long range goals, to not just say, oh, these are our DEI goals and just lump them all together. Really do get more intentional and start to separate what are some of our internal facing goals and what are some of our external facing goals. So hopefully that helped you think about that tension, or maybe false tension, between internal and external work. Thought I would share that with you all. If you want to hear more from me, you can find me on social media at Dr. Kira Banks on Facebook or Instagram, and Kira Banks on Twitter. Also, feel free to share with me what's happening in your organizations. What questions do you have for me? What interactions do you maybe want to get my take on? Happy to hear from you. Always love hearing from folks who listen. So thanks for joining me on Raising Equity.